On today's Locked On Giants podcast, the New York Giants and Detroit Lions met for the first of two joint practices. And boy, did things get hot. But you know what? That's a good thing for the Giants. I'm going to tell you why coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find my written work, NewYorkGiantsOnSI.com. And as always, welcome in to my Blue Crew community members, to my everydayers, to my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And if you are watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to the channel. Click the little bell for notifications every time I post a new video. I try and post a new video at least once a day, twice a day during training camp, including a short. And if you wouldn't mind, also like this video. It all helps at the end of the day. So again, thank you on end. And on today's show, the New York Giants met with the Detroit Lions for the first of two joint practices. And ladies and gentlemen, wowee, was that practice spicy. In my over 30 years of covering Giants training camps, I don't ever remember one being that spicy. And it's actually a good thing. And I'm going to tell you why it's a good thing as we get into the show. Then in segment 2, speaking of spicy, Daniel Jones, also spicy today. And even though you don't want to see happen what happened, I'll tell you why that's a good thing. So a lot of good to come out of this spiciness that I'm talking about. And then we'll wrap things up with some overall takeaways, general takeaways from watching the practices, or the Giants offense versus the Lions defense was on one field. And then on the other field, you had the Lions offense versus the Giants defense on another. And we kind of did like a split things up. I and another colleague split things up, and then we compared notes. And so I've got observations for you on that as well. So again, welcome on in. Let's talk about the spiciness. All right. Now, the Giants and Lions, let me take you back to last year. Last year, around this time, the Giants and Lions met in Allen Park, Michigan, which is where the Lions train. And they had two joint practices pretty similar to what they're doing now. And in those practices, you got to remember, the Giants were coming off a 9-7-1 season. They were feeling pretty good about themselves. Hey, we just made the playoffs. We won a playoff game. Now we're going to build on it and we're going to get better. And what happened? Well, they go to Allen Park, Michigan. They set foot on the field with the Lions, who would ultimately become the team that came within a sneeze of making the Super Bowl. And the Lions basically blew the Giants off the field in terms of physicality, in terms of imposing their will. I mean, the Giants basically during those joint practices last year didn't have any answers. They looked like they were getting their lunch money taken from them. So, you figure, okay, well, that was the first litmus test and then things would get better, but they didn't. We all know what happened. The Giants didn't really get better. Then they get to week 1. Dallas gets on the field with them, blows their doors off, and lo and behold, we're in for another bad season. So the New York Giants this year, they change things up a little bit. They come out and they have a brand new attitude, all right? They basically came out and they said to the Lions, okay, you might be the visitors, but we ain't in the mood to be hospitable to you. All right. Now, it was a very hot and humid day on Monday. All right. So when it's hot and humid and you're wearing pads and all this extra equipment and you're running around, your temper is going to be a lot shorter than it would be if you were sitting in air conditioning. The Giants set the tone with the Detroit Lions almost from the get go, right? So basically, they came in, they stood tall like Giants should, and they imposed their will on Detroit. And whenever there was some pushing and shoving or whatnot, the Giants didn't take it. They just went right back at the Lions. And they said, look, you're not going to come in here and bully us. You're not going to come in here and take our lunch money. Not on our watch, not on our terms, and not in front of our fans. So the Giants came out and they played with fire, with feistiness, with the spiciness that I'm talking about. And it was a version of the Giants that last year, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking back to last year and I'm saying, where was this version of this team that we saw today? I mean, I'll get to the football part a little later on in the show, but this attitude that the Giants showed, it's like, okay, you know what? We're tired of being mocked as the last, team to finish, the 32nd ranked team in this category or that category. We're tired of people saying we're going to have fewer than 6 wins. We're tired of being the laughing stock. We're going to do something about it. And you know what, folks? They did. Now, interestingly, the Giants, I don't know if you guys remember, but when Tom Coughlin was the head coach, he always had T-shirts printed up with different slogans, different quotes. Brian Daboll had the equipment staff create T-shirts with the acronym of DAWG, DAWG. And what does that stand for? Discipline, attitude, win, and grit. The essential ingredients that he wants to see in this team. And to their credit, in the first practice against the Lions, the Giants showed all this stuff. They didn't really go to start trouble. They didn't really instigate stuff. They came in with an attitude, which was, you're not going to push us around, Lions. We're going to set the tempo. We're going to dictate how things go. I think it's fair to say the Giants won quite a few battles against the Lions, which again, I'll get to a little later on. And the grit, to be able to get involved in these fisticuffs, if you will, and then, shake it off and come back and keep your focus and do what you had to do. That spoke volumes, I thought, about the Giants and just where they're at right now. So, it's interesting. When I wrote up my list of things to watch with, in these joint practices, I never thought to include that. And I don't know why. I should have probably. But it was so good to see the Giants look like the Giants that I remember, growing up. The Giants that took no fluff from anybody, that, imposed their will. Now, I don't know how that's going to transfer over to, or translate, I should say, to the regular season. But it's something that definitely gives you hope that moving forward, they're not going to, be patsies and pushovers. And Devin Singletary was one of the players who spoke to the media after practice. And he basically told us that Daboll and the team meeting before these joint practices said, hey, let's bring the juice. Let's show them what we're made of. Let's not take any, stuff from these guys. Now keep in mind, Daboll and Lions head coach Dan Campbell, they're buddies. But, all's fair in love and war. And when it comes to the football field, the Giants just weren't going to take it from the Lions, who, as you know, under Campbell, they are old school. They are gritty. I think Campbell had that famous line about biting kneecaps, which is kind of funny. Just thinking back to it. So kudos to the Giants for standing their ground against the Detroit Lions on day one. And we'll see what day two brings, but day one, they definitely stood their ground. Okay, speaking of standing their ground, in the next segment, Daniel Jones was a little spicy today. I'm going to tell you why that's a good thing, despite the fact that it maybe doesn't look like a good thing. So don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans. Major League Baseball is in full swing, as are the Olympics. And pretty soon, the WNBA will resume, as will the NFL, NBA, and NHL. There's just so much going on in the sports world these days that deciding what to bet on is harder than making the actual bet itself. And with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, placing your bets is so easy. You can choose from a wide variety of props, money lines, odds, futures, and more from any of the sporting events that are going on. And all this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all its customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head on over to fanduel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey, Giant fans, thank you for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen today. And now for your second listen, enjoy the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Get daily insights into the best fantasy draft strategies so that you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are talking New York Giants training camp, inside New York Giants training camp, the Giants and the Detroit Lions completing day one of their 2-day joint practice sessions. They'll have another one on Tuesday. Then Wednesday, I believe it's a walkthrough for each team, and then they will meet at MetLife Stadium Thursday night, 7 o'clock kickoff for the preseason opener for each team. So that's the agenda for the week. And of course, if there's a practice, we are here for you as always. So, all right. So in this segment, I talked about how spicy things were between the Giants and the Lions. And I want to specifically talk now about Daniel Jones and how he was a little spicy today with his, on-field demeanor and everything like that. Now, with all the fisticuffs that went on, the pushing and the shoving and whatnot, you knew eventually it was going to work its way over to the Giants offense because, look, the Giants offensive line and the Giants offense in general, they were pretty much having their way against the Lions defense, which was a good thing. And I'll get into that a little later. But there was one play in particular, actually 2 plays. So the first play, Daniel Jones dropped back to pass, and he got hit, which is a no-no in these practices. So he got hit, and Brian Dable came rushing up, screaming at the Detroit Lions about hitting the quarterback. Hey, you're not supposed to hit the quarterback. But he said it a lot more colorful than I just did. All right, so after that, I think it was a couple plays after that, Eric Gray took a pass, and this young cornerback, Morris, I think it's Morris Norris, I think is his name, comes flying in and literally decleats Eric Gray. All right. He hit him so hard that his helmet popped off, and Eric Gray is lying on the ground for several minutes. And that sparked one of the shoving matches between the teams. All right. So, they felt that at that point, the Lions had crossed the line. But there was another play that ensued. This time, again, there was some traffic in the middle, the offensive line and the defensive line mixing it up. And Greg Van Roten, who was playing center again, with John Michael Schmidt still sidelined, Greg Van Roten was down on the ground trying to get up. And the Lions looked like they were, I couldn't really tell if they were stepping on him, but they were keeping him from getting up. And that resulted in some pushing and shoving. I think Jermaine Illuminor got into it. And then all of a sudden, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Jones comes flying in with his red cape or red jersey, and he starts going after the Detroit Lions. And he's doing this until quarterback's coach, Shea Tierney, comes over and pulls him out of the melee. Now, here's why um, it's not a bad thing what Jones did, even though you don't want him getting in the middle of these melees, because you don't want your starting quarterback getting hurt. All right. Jones took on the approach that, look, if it were me, my teammates would come to my aid, so I'm going to go to their aids. And this is not the first time, by the way, Jones has done this, where he's jumped to a melee. A couple of years ago, or a few years ago, I should say, when Joe Judge was the head coach, there was this big, the Giants were practicing by themselves, and they suddenly had this big brawl that broke out, and Judge got so mad that he ejected players from the practice, and then he made everybody run laps. I'm surprised he didn't make us in the media run laps. But Daniel Jones, here's why this is a good thing, that he showed that spiciness to to his demeanor. All right. Besides the fact that, it's all about respect for him, it kind of shows you that Daniel Jones isn't going to go away quietly. All right. I've been talking about all spring long into the summer how Daniel Jones is playing with a chip on his shoulder. Okay. Obviously, when he found out about the Giants looking to potentially trade up to get a quarterback, that did not sit well with him. And he's admitted that. Jones has always been, when there were questions about, are you going to be ready to play and practice? His answer was, yep, not even a question as far as I'm concerned. So that was a little bit of a defiance. It's just, and then you watch Daniel in practice and you watch how he's moving and around and interacting with his teammates. You can't miss that chip on his shoulder. And the thing with Daniel Jones, historically speaking, at least since he's been in the NFL, is when his back is against the wall, that's when he delivers the goods. You go back to when the Giants decided not to pick up the option year on his contract. And he said, okay, guess what, guys? I'm going to show you. And what did he do? That was the 2022 season. Took them to the playoffs and won a playoff game. So basically, it forced their hand to give him the contract that he got. Obviously, with the escape hatch, but still, it forced their hand to give him, the contract that he currently has. So Daniel Jones, you watch him on the podium, you listen to him, and you think, boring, right? No, he's been operating all spring and into the summer with a fire in his eyes. You could see it in his demeanor that he is tired of being, mocked or doubted or questioned. This guy is determined to be the quarterback and to silence all the critics. Now, whether he can do so with his play, the jury is out. There's no excuses there. He supposedly has a better offensive line. He supposedly has better receivers. Okay. Malik Neighbors is everything that he was advertised as. He's going to have Daniel, is going to have Brian Dable calling the plays for him. There are no more excuses for him. It is up to him. And I think he knows that. And he's just going to come out swinging, figuratively speaking, of course, but, his back is against the wall. And this spiciness that he showed, getting involved in the mix and saying, just showing his toughness. No, you don't want to see that on a regular basis from your quarterback. But I think that was just part of the fire in this kid to really, stand up and say, okay, you know what? While you guys, the rest around the league are respecting the Giants for standing up to the big bad Lions, how about I get a little respect here? Got a little bit ways to go, obviously, because it's a little bit different situation. You got to see it in games. But Daniel is definitely playing with a chip on his shoulder. And you know what? I like it. I like it. I hope it translates into something good for him. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, but Pat, you spent the whole offseason talking about how they had to get a quarterback, how Daniel Jones is no good. Folks, I still say my jury is out on Daniel Jones. I like the attitude that he has shown. I like the way he has worked, his professionalism. I need to see more consistency from him before I sit here and say, okay, I was wrong. But you know what? I will happily admit that I was wrong if he comes out and he sets the league on fire. So, I mean, I'm big enough to admit when I was wrong, and I will if he does that. So we'll see if it happens. Fingers crossed that it does, because then it means that the Giants are winning. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? I know that's what I want. So, all right, coming up next, some final takeaways from the practice with the Detroit Lions. So don't go anywhere. This episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you ever find yourself comparing your life to those you see on social media? Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's so easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on their social media channel, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want to be instead of what others have, so that you can start living your best life. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. All you need to do is fill out a questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And if you find that your assigned therapist isn't a match, switch at any time for no additional charge. So go on and stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and it was a hot one today at Giants training camp, and not just the weather, but the action on the field. And, considering that the Lions came within a sneeze of making of going to the Super Bowl last year, this was a good litmus test. I know Brian Dable kind of downplayed it as a litmus test, but I thought it would be a good litmus test. And the way it was set up is you had the Giants offense and the Lions defense on one field, and then you had the Giants defense and the Lions offense on the other. So obviously, I couldn't be on two fields at once. I couldn't see two things. So I chose to be on the Giants offense versus the Lions defensive field. But I had a colleague, my colleague from SI who runs Detroit Lions on SI. He was on the other field. And we kind of compared notes and exchanged notes at the end of the day. So here are some takeaways that came from the practices. And I'm going to talk, mostly in general broad terms here. First off, I'm still concerned about the cornerback position. All right. There were instances in which Cordell Flott got absolutely burnt. All right. There were some miscommunications in that defensive backfield. Now, I know that Shane Bowen's defense is all based on communication and everything kind of running like clockwork, and they're still trying to get to that point. But gosh, you would have thought that it would be a little closer than what it actually is now. And not surprisingly, the Giants did bring in another cornerback into camp, a guy they claimed off waivers from the Washington Commanders. So the Giants waived running back Jashawn Corbin, who had been injured. And they added Christian Holmes, who they claimed off waivers from the Washington Commanders. So this is like the second cornerback they have added via waivers. Mario Goodrich was the other one. I think it was last week they added him. So they keep adding cornerbacks because, quite honestly, folks, the depth at that position is still a question mark. It really is. So that was maybe one of the negatives, if you will, on the day. Now, one other negative I'll give you, and this is also a concern, not as big of a concern to where people are talking about it, but they really probably should. The second team run defense of the Giants just wasn't good. All right. The Lions were picking up chunk yards on the ground, and the second team defensive line was struggling. That is another area. We're not talking about it enough, but the Giants have a lot of youth at that spot. And That's a position group that I'm still a little iffy about. All right. So maybe they get better. I don't know, but they didn't look very good today, according to my colleague who watched the Giants defense go against the Lions offense. All right. Now, what I was able to see, the Giants offensive line, which is still trying to come together and gel, they held their own against the Lions. All right. The Lions have a very good defensive front, but the Giants offensive line held their own, which was good to see. There was a little bit of leaks up the gut, but the Giants fixed that very early on. And basically, the quarterbacks had opportunities to throw. And I'm including the second team offensive line did fairly well, all things considered. So that was definitely encouraging to see. And again, remember, the Giants are missing John Michael Schmitz, who continues to be sidelined with that shoulder issue. We're not going to see him the rest of the week. I mean, I'd be stunned if he's back even after this game. All right. So Greg Van Roten has been playing center, which in itself is kind of a concern because they have Austin Schlottman and Jimmy Morrissey on the roster. And those guys now all of a sudden can't get first team reps to where Van Roten can go and move to guard, which is where he was really signed to play. So that's a little bit of a concern. But again, overall, they played well, the offensive line. So that was encouraging. Malik Neighbors, what can I say, folks? He comes as advertised. He was making fools out of the Detroit Lions secondary. Now, the Lions have a young and rebuilt secondary, and Neighbors was just making them look like fools. He was getting behind guys. He was separating, putting double moves on. I mean, it was so much fun to watch. This kid is so much fun to watch that, I can only imagine what he's going to do for an encore in games. Brian Burns, going back to the defensive side, Brian Burns basically lived in the Lions backfield. All right. So he had a really good practice. And another guy on the defense who had a really good practice, believe it or not, the forgotten man, Azeez Ojulari. So I know some people are like, well, are the Giants going to trade Azeez Ojulari or he's not going to make the roster? Don't be so fast to say that, folks, because I think there's going to be a spot for Azeez Ojulari on this roster. I thought Daniel Jones looked good on the offensive side. His throw, the first throw he had was almost picked off by Carlton Davis. So after that, he settled down and didn't look that bad. So he was moving the ball. He was in a rhythm. And like I said, for the most part, he was connecting with his receivers. Now, I think there were a couple of drops. There was that one deep play to Malik Neighbors that the officials ruled incomplete. But quite honestly, I thought maybe he caught it. I mean, the only thing I can think why they called it incomplete is because maybe he might have been juggling it a little bit. So maybe that had something to do with it. But it looked good to me. I mean, but then again, I'm not an official. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of positives. The tempo of the offense was good. They were in a rhythm. And, based on this one practice, and I know it's one practice against another team, but it was encouraging. There was a lot to be encouraged about because when you're watching the Giants in training camp go against each other, you don't always know if the offense is looking good and the defense is looking bad or vice versa, or what exactly the coaches have planned. So now you can kind of tell and get a better idea as to where this team is at. And I think overall, folks, Giants are not that bad off. There are still question marks. I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything has been answered and that's it. We don't have to worry. But some of the other glaring question marks, especially, the areas that Joe Shane looked to upgrade, they look pretty good. So I'm encouraged, but we will, of course, see once we get to the games. Now, one thing about the game that I will say before I call it a show, the final score doesn't matter in preseason. All right. Who cares if the Giants win by 20 or they lose by 30. What's going to matter is cohesiveness and player performance. So that's what you're going to want to look for. All right. Because remember, there's no game planning or anything like that. Everything's vanilla. It's basically a glorified scrimmage upgraded to where they're charging people to come in to watch it. So just keep that in mind when you watch the Giants game, the preseason games this year. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. As always, thank you for spending part of your day with us. Keep it here all week long. I'll have another show for you tomorrow, wrapping up the joint practices with the Detroit Lions. Until then, have a good one, everybody.